welcome to another episode of Walk Nation. In this episode, we'll be discussing anti-blackness in relation to Islam and our community. The show is obviously hosted again by me, Navat, and my co-host, Noon.
Hi, everybody. Hi. I should say to the listeners, whenever we record these, there's a massive time difference between us. So, yeah, forgive me for my mental fog. But yeah.
Yeah, so before we start, I just want to, just from the get-go say that black is beautiful, like, before we even begin anything, right? And yeah, black is beautiful, and black bodies are not inferior in any other way to other kinds of bodies, right? And I say that because, like, we will obviously talk about anti-blackness, and a lot of that, it will be negative, right? But the conclusion must always be that we must affirm ourselves, right? Like, our black bodies are not inferior to any other kind of body. And to me, obviously, we talked about this earlier. We talked about the difference between body positivity and body neutrality, right? I think a lot of people who are a part of the body positivity think of, in some ways they want to speak about blackness and black bodies as if they're superior to, white bodies and other bodies. And I want to say neither is true. Like, we're neither inferior nor superior compared to them. And
not to anybody, to any human being, like, really. Like, I mean, I even, to be honest, there's a part of me, obviously, black is beautiful, we know that, but even in saying that, I want to just add that I don't want to say all human beings, but yeah, technically all ethnic groups, all, racial identifiers of human beings are beautiful and important. But the reason why we're specifically mentioning or calling out blackness is obviously A, we're black. B, this is Whack Nation is primarily a podcast about black apostate, because we really, like, that's what, Ebe Wak is an ancient African god, and he's, a kind of a deity that's completely been forgotten, right? So basically, anyways, I said all this to say, the relevance of blackness to us and the reason why we're setting up this premise is essentially for the same reason why Black Lives Matter first initially existed, right? And initially I thought the hashtag, it's quite straightforward, but it's quite true. Black lives do matter, but it needed to be said because we do live in a world where, unfortunately, whether you're aware of it or unaware of it, there is some type of racial hierarchy, if you like. I believe it's more obvious perhaps in the East than maybe in the West, and that meaning that dark-skinned people or African people quite literally even have their organs stolen from them. Right? They're enslaved. They're treated poorly. There is whether a lot of Westerners, and I don't support Black Lives Matter. I should just add that disclaimer, the actual movement. But the reality is the reason why the hashtag resonated with so many people is everybody is aware of the fact that there is some type of anti-black discrimination in the world. And that's why we wanted to call this episode specifically around anti-blackness, not just racism, some kind of abstract concept, that kind of encompasses all human beings. No, we wanted to call out the racism the only racism that I've ever experienced, which is the underlying idea and concept that black skin and black features, specifically features that come from Africa, our fabulous kinky hair, our the ways our noses are structured, all of these things are inherently inferior to how you describe, but just inferior anyways to other human beings. So that's the reason why I believe initially Black Lives Matter took off so far and so wide, because everybody knows it to be true. Everybody's heard, like, especially non-Black people, obviously because this is an ex-Muslim podcast. So all Muslims know that Black people are on the lowest of the totem pole. And how do they know that? There are many hadith and there are no Quranic verses specifically calling out any human beings. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But yeah, there's no comment, but there's a lot of one of the most common stories in the Quran, not the sorry, the one of the most common Islamic stories is a story of Prophet Muhammad's so-called best friend, Bilal. You know, he was a black slave, and it's supposed to be a feel-good story in the Islamic context. That this black slave converted to Islam and then had a dream one night about the adhan. So I guess it is significant in many ways, right? Because this black slave actually came up with the call to prayer that you still hear today, right? Cute story, right? The not cute part about that story is this black slave was actually never freed in the lifetime of Muhammad, meaning there's actually no precedent in Islam for freeing black slaves. And we know, well, we all should know anyway, that slavery in the Middle East, African slavery in the Middle East was it went on for a lot longer. It was a lot more brutal, more vicious, so much so that there's no remnant of African that, you know, the slaves, because they were unitized. So anyways, I said all this to say, just to frame where our thought processes in this episode.
I just wanted to talk before we begin, like discussing anti-blackness in detail, right? I wanted to talk about what is, you know, blackness, or what does, like, how do we define being black, right?
Right. Yeah.
And even like from when I was young, right? My definition's always been simple. Like, if your skin is like brown or black, right? Or you have like, you know, African features, to me, you're always black. And one thing that always, you know, didn't bother me but perplexed me was how, like, certain people who had darker skin than me, like, let's say, you know, Indians or people from Desi backgrounds, how they somehow were exempt from being black, even though we have the similar skin tone, right? And we also
Okay.
both face, like, to some degree, discrimination based on that skin tone, right? So that never made sense to me. And
But
it's
I feel like they do get they are classed as dark skin. They might not be classed as black, but even within their own community, dark skinned Desis too are treated poorly. And like dark skinned Asians generally are, to me, blackness is not, it's broader than Africanness. You know, blackness to me is anybody with dark skin, really.
this day and age, I don't know, you know, if you've seen the same, you know, the same trend, right? But I feel like a lot of people are trying to, you know, restrict the definition of blackness, right? Like, they're trying to erase, you know, mixed
The
people.
police, yeah.
They're even trying to erase, you know, light-skinned people as if they're a different category of black, right? And
Mm-hmm.
to me, that never made sense, right? Like, because to me, if you're racial, I really like the term racialized as black, right? Like, if you're racialized as black, by example, even a person like Meghan Markle, right? Like, to some
Mm-hmm.
people, she passes as white, but to me, she's
Mm-hmm.
still black because she's racialized as black in, you know, in a
Yeah.
proper context, right? Like, she's still
Mm-hmm.
dragged, you know, and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, racist, you know,
And let's be
terminology
honest,
and
the thing is
stories are
that
made
people
against her.
hate about her. And what do people hate about her? People hate the fact that she's got a black mother. Whether people want to acknowledge that or not, but that's the one, you know, issue. Like, if you're half black, and if this, see, here's the thing: all Africans peoples know this. We know what it's like. It's called the one drop theory. I think it started in slavery, during the times of slavery. So, because obviously they were raping the slaves, you know, the African women. So they had to come up with some type of system, because there were obviously, there are so many mixed people from, you know, the raping of these slaves. Entire countries have been formed, you know, that now still exist. You know, that's the Dominican Republic, you know, Puerto Rico. These are all, you know, products of this mixing. But anyways, so the slave owners had to come up with differentiation, because they obviously could not, you know, they had these mixed children. And, you know, slavery went on. I think people in the modern world sometimes underestimate how long it went on for. It went on for hundreds of years. So these slaves were raped over generations, you know. So they produced, you know, in Brazil, for example, like there's a whole scale, right, of how they determine. And there's, you know, all these names, and they all go back to the slave days, you know, because it would be like, and in America, I think it's like quarter troon, quadroon, mixed race, blah, blah. And all this is ways to differentiate and yourself from not being white. That's
Exactly.
all ways of you. Yeah, exactly. Because these individuals may have been so-called white passing, but like, just like Meghan Markle, but the reality is they had a black ancestor, and that was good enough. The one drop of, you know, our blood was seen as heinous in the West. So these ideas, yeah, anyway, I digress. Continue, Nabet, with that point.
Exactly. So we talked about, what is blackness, right? Then we can talk a
Yeah,
little bit about what is anti-blackness. And we talk about anti-blackness and not racism because anti-blackness is a complex, right? It's a complex of prejudice, discrimination, mistreatment, um,
right.
based on perceived or racialized blackness, right? And
And
one of the
also,
reasons one of the reasons I really like anti-blackness is that it's not just, racism because it's not just an external thing, right? Like one of the most insidious form of anti-blackness is the internalized anti-blackness, like the
right.
ones that, we within our communities exercise against each other. And one thing you taught me about is that one kind of like almost overseen or ignored form of, anti-blackness is the one applied to people who are light skinned, right? Where they are bullied, sexual. Actually,
Yeah,
not only are
sexualized
they,
community. Yeah. Yeah.
hmm?
This talking about like mixed race and kind of light skin.
As not just mixed race, but specifically light skin,
Right,
black
right.
people, right? Because I feel like there's no empathy or sympathy for them, right? They get bullied, like, both online and real life. They get, otherized, like they're almost like, excluded from blackness because
Right.
a large part of it because people have a resentment against them, right? They see them as having privilege, and they're sort of blaming the individual for something they cannot control, right?
But let's frame
And
the actual racism itself, though. Let's just go back, take it back one step here, and say, what is it? What is it about blackness that people, firstly, what is the hate that people are internalizing, and what are the hate that people are projecting onto us? So, um, there's a lot of stereotypes and a lot of myths that pertain to blackness. Um, that are unique to people of African descent. Like, there's a lot of stereotypes, for example. Some are positive, some are negative, or some are kind of in between. I don't know what you think of them. Like, for example, a lot of people think all black people are really good musically. I remember when I was growing up, that was the thing that was thought. We're really great entertainers, really great at sport, because obviously, you look at particularly in America at how successful African Americans are just in general in every
category when it comes to
category. They're successful, quite successful.
sport and even
But they're overrepresented. Yeah, exactly. But once again, in sport and entertainment, all these things, they're overrepresented. So there are some kind of positive or neutral stereotypes. But then there are the extremely negative stereotypes, like black people being hypersexual, right? Black men having, larger penises. That is, and here's the thing: that stereotype might be something that we, laugh off and say, oh, do you know what? Is that a big deal? But it is a huge deal. That it's the cause of, there's a whole phenomena of there's a lot of discrimination that black men face, and it's because of this. In my opinion, it's a myth that black men are more sexual than other types of men. I don't think black men. I think all humans are the same, really. And
and one you
you
know one like one stereotype in
yeah,
particular about black men, and
yeah,
the insidious thing is it also applies to black, male children, right? So
yes, yes.
there's this idea that black men are like, these very violent creatures, right? Like they're
Mm-hmm.
just waiting
And
to
predators, yeah.
to blow up, right? And the sad thing is applied to, children as, as young as like 8 years old or 10 years old, right? Like there was a
Yeah,
study that showed that when people looked at, black male children, they assumed that they were older than they actually were.
yeah, they
So what happens
adultify
to
our children. Yeah,
they were adultified, right? So they sort of lost their innocence because there was this idea that, that first of all they grew up, and they also projected a lot of things about, the way the negative views they had of black men were applied to black male children. Um,
right.
and that is just so sad.
Yeah, black girls and women are sexualized at a young age as well too, because of our bodies. Because blackness is seen as very um other races look at us, as being hypersexual and so on. And you know, our bodies are quite unique, like our hair, and so on. So there is a stereotype of us kind of being more sexual and Yeah, it's really disturbing. It can really detrimentally impact girls and women. Um, and it's something that, you might say, oh, well, look at all these, female rappers, and, Megan Thee Stallion, that are, Beyonce, that are shaking their ass naked. What I would argue is actually the stereotype of Black women being, kind of hypersexualized, just generally, has actually been something that goes back historically a long time. Even in the time of Prophet Muhammad, we have examples of slave women never wore clothes. So these women and the slave women were Black in the time of the Prophet. So these women were walking around quite literally nude. That's how slaves used to be in the Middle East. Only the only women that were veiled were the wives of the Prophet. And later, look, in Islamic history, you have to know Islamic history quite well. Most of the women initially didn't veil. Or did they veil? Well, to be honest, I can only think of right now off the top of my head examples of the wives of the Prophet. Like I remember the stories of when they veiled, but I can't really think of other women.
Yeah,
Like
one
just
interesting
women.
yeah, one interesting thing about the veil or the hijab in the beginning, right? It was
Yeah.
it was a signifier of status, right? So it was a
Right.
signifier that not only were you a free woman, but you were also a woman who were claimed, by another man. It's one
Right.
of the reasons why, in some of the hadith, they're actually, what is it called? They're actually, penalizing, slave women for trying to
Mhm.
put on hijabs, because that would mean that they're signifying that they're higher class than they actually were.
But yeah, just so look, we don't get distracted on a hijab tangent, I just want to say on the last bit, this is why hijab fashion in 2022 is an oxymoron. It's nonsensical. Imagine, uh, it's honestly, whenever I see hijabis talking about, I feel so beautiful in my hijab, or, I'm trying to feel sexy in my, I'm just like, like, have we reached the twilight zone? Like, this is, anyways, I digress. But it's like how last episode I said, in order to even talk about Islam to a Muslim, you would have to teach them the religion, then, assert
Then you would have
your,
the conversation, right? Like
then
you
you
have,
have a conversation. It's a 3 hour, conversation, to have a basic chat, about the hypocrisy. But anyway, I digress. Back to the matter at hand. So yeah, you might say, oh, Norn, well, there's hip hop and, blah, blah. Well, I would actually argue that the only way those Black women um, got platforms is by being hypersexual, because the market only allows for a certain stereotype. Similar,
exactly.
it's like being a masculine Asian girl. You're not going very far. You know what I mean? You've got to be that cutesy little docile, you know, there's a certain stereotype, racial stereotype, um, foisted upon you, right? And that's what it's expected of you. So what I'm saying, Nicki Minaj, Megan Thee Stallion, all of these, um, they have to engage like that. Otherwise, they won't sell, and that's sad. That's sad in and of itself. I feel for them because their talent cannot shine because they're being packaged in a certain way. You might say, oh, no, they could package themselves differently. No. Well, we've known, like, the music industry, is particularly in the US, has been overrepresented by Black artists since it pretty much began. Okay, and we've always had the power balance of these non-Black, let's just say non-Black executives that determine what's going to be acceptable for the culture. And if you're paying for it, if they're the they're the ones who are signing off on the bottom line. So they are essentially responsible for what we see, the images we see in Black culture. It's not necessarily the artists. They're just trying to get by. They're just existing in a space that has been carved out for them. But they can't, like Drake, for example, he can't sell himself as, an intelligent Jewish scientist. He's not going to be taken seriously, as the Black guy. He's got to be a rapper, and present a certain way. And that's the root for what I'm trying to say. To be a successful in the entertainment industry, yes, the powers that be do determine the Black image, right? The bottom line is, if Black artists' image are hypersexual and not in line with even perhaps their own values, I don't fault the artist necessarily. It's like I fault the game, the whole entertainment industry that allows Taylor Swift. We can't have black women that are like Taylor Swift. That would never happen. A black woman that's like Taylor Swift, boring, plain looking, ordinary, you know, that just sings about, boring,
Breakups.
ordinary things. Yeah, just but in a girl next door way, as they say, the girl next door. We wouldn't be marketed that way. And I say this, by the way, as an insider. I model I do music videos. I work with artists and stuff like that in my actual life. So I do understand the way these artists, these entertainers are being packaged, and it is extremely anti-black. And rooted in exactly these ideas about African and black peoples that we're discussing. Similar to the black men being harassed by police, that's a real nuanced conversation. It's not as easy as saying, well, it just never happens. Like some people on the right will say, oh, a lot of Black Lives Matter statistics and stuff are overblown and exaggerated. And to some degree, I would agree that, there is maybe some exaggeration on because Black Lives Matter, the individuals that are behind that are quite disingenuous. So it has nothing to do with anything. But that being said, the idea of police brutality goes back, once again, hundreds of years. We've got examples of black people being murdered, everything from Emmett Till. I'm talking in the West, we have,
Actually, they actually arrested the woman who accused Emmett Till of sexually harassing her.
Good. She's like 72, yeah?
Yeah.
Good. My God. I like that story. It's horrific. It's, burned into, I think, most Western blacks' minds, because we learn about it in school.
Like a lot of a lot of black tragedies we don't learn about I don't know, I didn't learn about Emmett Till. To be honest, a lot of it's American history, so it makes sense I didn't learn about it. But there's like a lot of, what do you call it, black history that obviously we don't learn about in Europe because there's not a lot of black people.
We had like a quite racist, like in Australia. It's not that it's racist per se, but it's okay. It is actually. It's not against African people. It's against the Indigenous Australians. They sort of never wanted them to self-actualize. So when I was growing up, I didn't get taught. There's a lot of African American history that was, in my opinion, purposely removed from Australian textbooks, and that's so that example wasn't there for the Indigenous black people in like we never like when we learned history, we learned European history, but it's something that's changing. The reason why I mention it now is because it's something that has changed now. The curriculum is completely different. That's why my accent is borderline kind of English. It's not really, but it's like Australian schooling for a long time was had that real colonial, because this is land that was taken from dark-skinned black people. I consider the black people, even though they're not African, they're Australasian. But yeah, Indigenous people are obviously black. Yeah.
I wanted to piggyback on what you said, like the way we limit black people, right? So
right.
One thing I really wanted to talk about was Ayaan Hirsi, right? And
yes,
I don't want to talk, about her politics per se, but the way
MVP,
people,
the GOAT, the greatest
right?
the greatest Somali ex-Muslim of all time. We have to say that. It's like how Muslims say peace and blessings be upon him for Prophet Muhammad. That's how Somali ex-Muslims feel about Ayaan Hirsi. Peace and blessings be upon her.
Well, obviously not all Somali ex-Muslims.
Oh yeah.
Otherwise, I wouldn't have brought up this.
The irrelevant ones, yeah, we're not those who must not be named.
we do not associate with those people. But one thing I really hated is the fact that they would use like literally racist terms like coon, right, to describe Ayaan Hirsi.
Yes.
And I've always, and even I knew at that time that it was still racist term, right? But I didn't actually have the way to articulate why it was racist term. But it's at its essence quite dehumanizing, because it's again very limiting of black people saying, well, if you don't have these set of ideas and if you're associated with this set of people, then you're excluded from blackness, right? Which means that the only group of people who can incorporate and experience the full range of political opinions are white people. And if you're a black person who thinks differently, well, then you're no longer black. And it's just so dehumanizing and limiting, but also it's like intellectually lazy. That's also a problem, right? like it short circuits, the whole system. Because when you think, well, why would this person think this way and believe these things? No, there must clearly be, under the trance of the black, the white man, right? Like it's so intellectual lazy, because you have to actually look at people's history and treat them as actual people. Like if people believe certain thing or say certain thing, usually it comes from their experience and their own conclusion. And saying this whole idea with, well, they've been convinced by the white man, really tells us how little you think of black people. Like if they come to a certain conclusion, oh, then surely it must have been the white man who's convinced them.
Yeah, but we've got to move away from this idea that we're a monolith. I think Chichi Adichie Okosi, one of the most, important modern writers in our modern time, this Nigerian writer, she talks about the danger of a single story. And this is where I think a lot of diaspora blacks in general, because I don't only think it's African Americans, I think it's Africans as well too, we're all guilty of trying to shoehorn all black people into a single mindset, a single political set of ideals, and it's not going to be, it's never going to be, and it's okay. We are individuals, and this is what we want to become individuals and be judged on the content of our character. Lord, I mean, Martin Luther King died forever ago, and it's like we're still on this, like, we need to, I'm talking about within ourselves. Blacks need to judge other blacks based on the content of the color of their character, rather than the color of their skin. But that being said, I want to ask you a question about Ayaan Hirsi, and what, maybe our listeners can listen and comment in the comments with their response. But my question to you and the audience is: do you think, speaking of anti-blackness in the ex-Muslim context, do you believe Ayaan Hirsi would be the de facto leader of the ex-Muslim movement had she been an Arab or a Desi, as opposed to being a dark-skinned Somali?
Absolutely.
In my opinion, yes.
Absolutely, without doubt.
Absolutely, without a doubt. Let me just say, I believe most ex-Muslims disrespect and are disrespectful towards Ayaan Hirsi or dismiss her message completely. Like, they haven't even read her books. Like, Ayaan has done so much, you can do, like, she's done so much for us to pave the freaking way. And, it really frustrates me. It gets on my nerves the way they don't pay her no respect, like, I mean, they're like, it's so hard for me. Oh my God. And this is why I don't feel sorry for them, with their white skin in the West, talking about, oh, it's so hard for me to come out as an apostate from Islam. I'm like, but you blend into society. You're just screaming from the rooftops, you know what I mean? And, causing a ruckus. That's why it's hard for you. It's not because, you're not like Ayaan Hirsi that had 24 hours, still has 24 hours security. You're not like her that, try to put herself on the line, put her views up in parliament, was debating Muslims directly, so I don't empathize, because my first question is, do you empathize with Ayaan Hirsi? If it's no, I'm like, okay, because I feel like a lot of ex-Muslims have a remnant of anti-blackness from their upbringing. All Muslims know that, especially ones from Desi backgrounds, from Arab backgrounds. And honestly, to be honest with you, this is why I really can't stand when they try to lump us all in under the guise of people of color. Don't ever call me a people of goddamn color. I'm not colored. Call me black African, or what we are, which is Somali. I mean, in my case, Somali Ethiopian. You can call me by my name, but don't ever call me a people of color or whatever, because I feel like that lumps us with people that we have nothing in common with, but they get to benefit from the hard work of black people, which I'm talking about people that have paved the way, like Nelson Mandela, like Martin Luther King, like these legendary figures in the West that are black. No, I'm not. You're not going to stand on the shoulders of giants and not pay them homage. I think it's offensive to me as a black person, like that Ayaan Hirsi's not given her credit, and yeah.
But to be honest, I think there's also a distinction, right? Like people who read her books and actually, looked into her story fully, right? They will give her the credits, right? Like the more you know about her, especially if you read her books, right? Because it's one thing to be told about what Ayaan Hirsi is, but if you read her books and actually look at her from an academic point of view, like it's impossible for you not to respect her and support her.
Yeah, but here's the thing: a lot of these ex-Muslims have not even looked her up. They're not even interested. Like, they have never read Nomad. Like, there was one Aussie Arab guy And I remember, we were like, I can't remember if she was Arab or Desi, and he really loved her work. And that was really shocking for me. And that to me reminded me like of the contrast. Like, this is why I've got respect for Yasmin, because Yasmin is quite close to Ayaan as well too. But Yasmin's different as well too, because she's Egyptian. Like, I don't know, Egyptian to me is like, they're like a bit different to other Arabs. Like when it comes to East Africans for sure. But I'm talking about, there's like a lot of Desi Asian ex-Muslims that have platforms, and they're anti-black. And, a lot of Asians, for example, they're all Asian anyway. They know in their own countries, in their own cultures, they treat dark-skinned people like second-class citizens. So they know, so African people should be scared. Like, we're not even like completely dehumanized for them. So yeah, I mean, when the ex-Muslim movement talks about, I think that's why a lot of us were not really going far. And this is why it frustrates me when a lot of them bring up slavery and Muslims, because I'm like, have you done any of the work in your own self to unpack your ideas about Black people? Because,
That's actually a really good segue to our last topic, right? So we want to talk about anti-blackness and Islam, right? Because what was interesting was like I was actually looking for articles like, critically dissecting, the way, Islam can be racist, right? Or the way it can inflame anti-blackness. And like the first 3 pages of Google was just, a bunch of articles about, well, actually Islam is for equality, and they will take this, specific Quran verse and be like, the Prophet in his last sermon said, everybody was equal. And I just look, and to much, it's so frustrating because if you're, a never Muslim and you look at it, you're like, wow, this religion really is, egalitarian. But then you think about the history, right? Like even as late as like the 1960s, they were selling Black, bodies as slaves.
Literally. I was
Yeah.
going to say, it's not even gymnastics. It's a pretzel. You got to turn yourself into a goddamn pretzel.
Like the idea that there's like, that this religion, respects Black people is like, no, they don't. Like you've had over 1,400 years of like, period of time where you've been selling Black bodies, we've been castrating Black bodies, we've been, raping,
And be clear. When Muslims came to Africa, and they were purposely not converting Africans so they could enslave them. That is the history. That is the Islamic history that has never been reconciled.
And then they're trying to tell you that, they're all for Blackness. Like there's like, first of all, slavery is obviously one big exception, right? Not exception, like one big counter towards the idea of, Black, that this religion is, pro-Black, right? Another aspect is also like the Arab supremacy. Like Muslims really don't want to talk about it, but there's like a very clear, distinct Arab supremacy in this religion, right? Like you have to speak in Arabic, you have to pray in Arabic, you pray to an Arabic country, right? The history is in Arabic. And one thing that to me is very, illuminating about, where Black people stand in Islam, right? It's like if we were truly represented in this religion, why do so many, Muslims who are Black feel a need to become more, Arabic? Like feel a greater need to adopt Arab customs if it's truly just.
But to be fair, I was going to say, you see Asian Muslims as well doing it. And you see, like, if you even see white converts, like with their assalamu alaikum, their little butchered Arabic, they're trying to do the most. The point is it's a supremacist worldview with Arabs at the top. And
exactly
any kind of worldview that's supremacist, whether it's Asian, European, Arab, whatever, which is Asian anyway, but anyway, whatever the worldview is, like there should be no human being is more, no racial group is more superior than another. Oh my God, I sound like a Bob Marley song, but that's really what it comes down to. No one group is more superior than the other. And in Islam, I think I feel sorry. In a way, I feel bad for Black people because half of Black people are obsessed with the Christian God and the European, the white supremacist, kind of Christian ideal. So half of Africa is, in wigs, trying to emulate European features to get acceptance from Jesus, the white Jesus. And then the other half of Africa is desperately bleaching their skin, trying to erase their indigenous languages, to speak Fusha, to become more Arabs. Exactly, to become Arab, And yeah, that's what Nubbles was talking about earlier, about the light skin, dark skin privilege, and this kind of proximity, what they call in the West, proximity to whiteness. Now, in the Somali context, in our context, we don't necessarily have, because for us, white supremacy is not our thing, right? It's all about Arab supremacy. It's like if you're not, pick your poison, honestly. Anyway, so for us, like people that are light skinned, like myself, are given. I wouldn't say we're not given a privilege, but if we're given, if we're treated preferentially, it is because of my proximity to be seen as an Arab rather than an African, which is very ironic considering I'm an ex-Muslim, but that's what it comes down to. The proximity to being Arab, the idea, and at the root of it is the proximity to God, right? Because God is an Arab, whether it's explicitly, or implicitly implied, it's there that God is an Arab. Just like
it's quite telling that
yeah.
Black people have been erased from like the history of this final holy text, right? Like I cannot think of something that is more racist. Like literally
Right.
every other race is excluded except Arabs and Jews.
Right. It's nonsensical, and this is their one claim
Like
to
really,
say.
if you think about it, like God is a racist.
Yeah, of course he's racist. No, Allah is a racist. They're their idea, because there's 7,000 gods. I mean, on Earth, also, so give or take, maybe even up to 10,000. Who knows? So Allah, the Arabian god, is absolutely anti-black. But to be fair to Allah, he's also anti-Asian. He's also anti-European. He's anti-anybody. Allah is absolutely anti-Jewish, which is very ironic considering he claims to be Yahweh as well. But I digress. That's a whole nother episode. But yeah, so yeah, to be fair to Allah, Allah is an equal opportunity hate. You know what I mean? He hates all humans that are not Arab, not willing to speak Arabic. So
Exactly, but it still relates to like the anti-blackness, right? Or at the very
yeah,
least, because the thing I really dislike is while, and there's like a lot of areas where Muslims are so disingenuous, I'm almost offended. But I also have to
right,
remind myself that these people, are caught by this, religion, right? And one
yeah,
of the areas is when they're trying to talk about, like, it's not like, it reminds me about the debate about feminism, right? Or women's right. It's like that.
mm-hmm.
I feel offended whenever they talk about, oh, this religion, has given women so many rights. And even worse when they're trying to, chastise people like, Andrew Tate. But that's a whole other debate, right? Where they're
Mm-hmm.
like, he's nothing like this religion. And I'm just looking at him like, you do know when we look at his crimes, right?
Right.
I do see some patterns.
Oh my God, yeah.
So
That
yeah,
actually, that's a good segue into. Hang on, actually, I wanted to ask the one more question. Actually, now that I think we've got time to fit this in. But I wanted to ask: is there actually any privilege to being Black? Because in my opinion, there actually is. I know we spent some time speaking about all the negatives and all the challenges that exist for Black people, but I also wanted to explore that the concept of, is there such a thing as Black privilege? Now, I derived the idea from Charlemagne the God. He's a really annoying, really, really annoying radio host, like in New York, radio host dude. Anyway,
but a broken
so
clock.
yeah, look, even a broken clock can be right twice a day. So what was I going to say? So this guy came up with a book years ago that he titled The Black Privilege. And this was, I think, a bit before Black Lives Matter, but he was talking about how, he felt a privilege, to, being Black okay, I should add a disclaimer. I'm talking about specifically in the diaspora. I understand outside the diaspora, shout out to, and we did not mention enough, the struggles of Libya. You know what, maybe we do a whole episode, because I'd really love to spend a lot of time on Libya. So stay tuned for content on Libya and maybe Yemen in an episode later on. But yeah, so because outside, I just had to add that disclaimer, because outside the diaspora, it's not only deadly to be Black, like there are Black people dying in the Mediterranean. We know that Africans being treated horrendously in Ukraine. It's quite dehumanizing, in Libya, and Egypt, where there are reports of African refugees having their organs sold. It's quite horrific. But within the diaspora itself, I'm talking about specifically, especially in the Anglosphere. So the Anglosphere is, America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and the EU. there can be quite a privilege being Black. And that, when I say privilege, I mean, yeah, I can't, like, for example, if you're an attractive Black male or a Black female, I believe, you kind of, people do treat you differently. I don't know. That's been my experience. Have you experienced anything, any kind of positives associated with being Black, the connotation?
Positive. Like, I don't know whether you call it privilege, but I definitely associate it with, actually, I can't say, unequivocally, because I have to think back like a long time
Let me
ago.
frame it. Let me frame it. I think let me help you. I feel like one of the privilege, I think, for example, when it comes to Muslims in the Ummah, I remember I used to go to Islamic school, and I went to Islamic school with every single type of Muslim on earth. And I would say by far, it was probably easiest for me, even though I stuck out the most of all my peers, just being dark skinned in Australia. Obviously, the majority of people are white, or because we had a white Australia policy when I was just a couple of years before, I mean, 2 decades before I was born. I mean, 15 years before I was born. So when I was growing up in Australia, it was completely white. There was no, and even the migrants were white skinned. But that being said, I would say it was easier. It was a lot easier for me to not assimilate, but yeah, people had really positive, like everybody in Australia, I would say, consumed American music. And obviously, America is really, in Australia, even more so than the UK. I believe America is a bigger example to Australians. So there's a love for American culture. Anyways, I said all this to say, I would say I definitely benefited from the success of Black people in America and their image, like, because Black people are incredibly successful, and yeah, just, I don't know. I think there are many unspoken privileges of being Black. People assume, you know, a lot of things. Like, I wouldn't say we're the preferred minority, but I would say, for example, there was a period, definitely, especially when the war on terror first began, I would say it was infinitely easier for me as a Somali to blend into wider Australian society than it was for people that looked visibly what they would consider Muslim. So Arabs, even Desis and so on. There is a friction, between, I would say, other Westerners. And I would say, as a Somali, because I was dark skinned already, people just assumed I was Black. So they didn't even think about my Muslimness. So in that regard, I would say it's quite, I don't know, for me, I see it as a Black privilege, because for me, being ex-Muslim, like, honestly, I only talk about ex-Muslim issues out of love, direct love for my Somali side, like my mum's side that raised me, and like, giving back to that community. But aside from, like, I navigate quite comfortably in white Australia, and that's because of white guilt, because they feel bad about their ancestors colonizing, and I'm just saying, it's quite, for me, it's been quite a positive thing being Black, in the West. In the time, I also think the time I'm living helps. I don't think if I was living in 1854, it would have been cute. But you know, yeah, I do think there's a Black privilege in the modern era. I think Black people dominate, still dominate entertainment, meaning they have, meaning Black culture is quite central in pushing, like, you have quite a lot of cultural capital just existing as a Black person in the West. So anyways, I wanted to leave it on that positive note, that there are a lot of really great things to be happy and proud of. The blacker the berry, still the sweeter the juice. So I think I'm going to leave it there for today's episode. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll leave you here for today's conversation, but join us again next time, where we will be dissecting, and brace yourselves, we will be dissecting the manosphere. I don't know if any of you guys have checked out, but you guys can do your own research whilst we're recording. So the Kevin Samuels, the Andrew Tates of the world, examining the line that the manosphere is flirting with radical Islam, and why it is that so many of these now new public internet figures are enamored with Islam, and where are the intersections there. So join us next week.